So this week I titled the sermon, Trust in God. Interestingly, that was the title of the one song we sang this morning. But trusting in God, where does our trust lie? Do we trust that God will do what he says he will do? Do we trust that God will do the right thing? And not just the right thing, do we trust that God will do the best thing? Today we're going to be looking in a story in the Gospel of John. And interestingly, this story, in case you haven't heard of it, it's where Jesus changes water into wine. Now, we are in a denomination that teaches abstinence from alcohol, so that's also interesting that we are looking at a story today about Jesus changing water into wine, but that's where we are heading. So we're going to jump in John chapter 2, right at the beginning, in verse 1. And this is, John doesn't start off his book of the Bible, his version of Jesus' life. He doesn't start off like the others, where they talk about Jesus being born and Mary and Joseph at the beginning of it all. John starts off talking about the Word becoming flesh, but here we are in chapter 2, and there wasn't a whole bunch of chapters before this, like telling us about Jesus' early life. So we are jumping in when Jesus is an adult. So here we are in John chapter 2, verse 1 and verse 2. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So when we're looking, it says on the third day, that is not, it's just saying connected to whatever John was thinking about before. On the third day, there's a wedding. And it's near, roughly, most likely, where Jesus was from, near Nazareth. And Jesus' mother was there. So Mary is at this wedding, and Jesus and his disciples. Now notice it doesn't mention anything about Joseph being there. Scholars believe that's because Joseph was probably no longer living by this point in time. So Joseph died sometime between Jesus being 12 years old and his parents wondering where he was. He was at the temple reading. And this point where there's a wedding and Mary's at it, but Joseph is not mentioned. So most likely Joseph wasn't alive. Mary was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited. Weddings were big celebrations. They wanted as many people as possible to be invited to celebrate, and it was a multi-day celebration. Here, weddings generally are one day. You have the ceremony, you have the reception, but in Jewish culture at the time, the weddings were multi-day, like lots of guests, lots of celebrating. Let's keep going. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." So we go right from Jesus is at this wedding, suddenly the wine is gone, and Mary says something to Jesus about the wine being gone. So wine was part of wedding celebrations back then, and interestingly, wine was different then than it is now. Wine was very diluted back in the day. It was a mixture of their version of wine and water. So the alcohol content wasn't the same as what wine exists today, and they didn't have the same properties available to distill stuff the same or ferment the same, but the wine was gone. This would have been a huge embarrassment if the guests were still there partying and the wine is gone, there's no more to drink. So the wine is gone. It's more like a social problem, an embarrassment type problem, not a problem like, the groom just died, or the bride just got hurt. Jesus, do something. So this is seemingly to us like, okay, there's going to be a little bit of embarrassment, but Mary still goes to Jesus and says, they have no more wine. I was reading one person's commentary on this story, and they were thinking, why did Mary go to Jesus to say there was no more wine? And they were surmising, maybe when Jesus was little, Mary had run out of an ingredient and he did something and brought it back. Or maybe Mary burned something one time and Jesus did some kind of miracle and unburned the food. We don't know any of that. That was just what this person online was saying. But Mary goes to Jesus. She's his mother. She knows something about him and says to him, they have no more wine. Now this is the first, or this is before Jesus has done any miracles publicly. So Jesus had been growing up. Mary had promises of what Jesus was going to do and be from when he was in her womb, and she had been storing those promises up. But up until this point, Jesus wasn't out healing people. Jesus wasn't out multiplying bread. Jesus wasn't out walking on water yet. Nothing like that had been done. But Mary knows. Last week, Pastor Steve talked about puras and how we need someone as a sense of encouragement, an encourager in our life. And he mentioned mothers being those that can encourage. So here's Mary. Jesus has not begun yet. And she says, hey, the wine, they don't have any more wine. Let's continue on. Jesus says to her, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. So that the term woman there, we would not address our mothers like that, woman. So when we read that, it seems to us like, okay, is he being disrespectful to his mom? No, he was not. That was a term of endearment then, like ma'am, mom. So he wasn't being rude, but he says, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. He is saying, you know, I haven't started my ministry yet. I haven't done anything like this yet. Why are you even telling me? So Jesus knew once his ministry started, once he started healing people and doing miracles, it wouldn't be long until he was led to Jerusalem and he would be killed. So while he was a willing sacrifice, God in human form, there was still going to be some pain involved, a lot of pain actually. So he's telling Mary, why are you telling me? My hour has not yet come. Now remember, this is his mother. So I'm surmising also that when she is saying this to him and he's looking at her, my hour has not yet come, why are you telling me? And he has a twinkle in his eye, as does she, because they know he can do something about this. And once again, it's not like something drastic in our minds, like bringing someone back from the dead. And yet Mary still goes to Jesus with this seemingly insignificant problem. Just, we don't want our friends to be embarrassed. The wine's run out. And Jesus says, why are you telling me? My hour has not yet come. So she's giving him a little kickstart in, okay, it's probably time for you to get this show on the road, even though she probably didn't fully understand that him getting a kickstart to his ministry was going to lead to him being crucified. But nonetheless, she knew that God had promised significant things for her son. So Jesus says that to her, and then we move on to the next verse. John chapter 2, verse 5. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So it goes from Jesus saying, why are you even telling me this? My hour has not yet come. And Mary turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. So Jesus, or she knows, Jesus is going to listen to me. I'm his mother. And she knows that he's not going to argue anymore. He's going to do something about this. Now, in this book, I started reading this little short book by Max Lucado about prayer. And this parable is this story is in some of the opening chapters. And it talks about Mary in that moment. She is asking Jesus to move. And she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. She doesn't try to come up with a plan of her own. How often do I make a prayer request to God that also gives him some convenient suggestions on how to let it all play out? In our humanity, we can see, or at least we think we can see, what the future might hold if this happens, or if this happens, or if this happens. So we often go to God and say, hey, God, can you do this? Because then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. So I kind of have it all figured out for you. You just got to do this tiny little detail and make it all work. Mary doesn't do that. She doesn't try to overthink it. She's not trying to give Jesus all the suggestions on what to do to make more wine show up at this wedding. She just takes the request to Jesus and tells the servants, do whatever he says. Do we have that kind of faith, that kind of trust in God, that we can take a need to him and then just trust he's going to work it all out? Mary didn't have any of the details. Do we have that same trust that God will be God and God will do something. God will work on our behalf, even if we don't know what the next step might be. Can we just take it to God and lay it at his feet? Because that's the kind of faith Mary had in that moment. Do whatever he tells you. Can we take a request to God and say, do whatever is best? Because that's where our hearts need to be. So we continue on, still in John 2, but now verses 6 through 7. It said, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. So it's kind of hard, well, it's probably not hard to imagine 6 big jars, 20 to 30 gallons each in this house, and they were empty, and they needed to be filled with water. When we need water, we just go turn on a faucet. But they had to be filled. We have sinks that can just give us however much water at any time we want. But there were these jars. Jews had specific rules on how to wash their hands and what things needed to be done before they could eat and all of that. So most likely the jars had been filled with water. All the people at the wedding had used the water to do the washing that they needed to do, and now the jars are empty. So Jesus tells them, fill the jars with water. Just a normal thing. Go fill the jars with water. The servants do it. It's interesting that the servants didn't say anything like, but that'll take a lot of work. Does God ever ask us to do something? We're asking him for help. He tells us to do something, and then we argue with him about what he wants us to do. Oh, God, I can't do that. That's going to make me look weird. Or I can't say that. Someone's going to get mad at me. Or I can't. We try to make different excuses for why we can't do whatever God is telling us to do. It would have taken time for the servants to fill those jars with water, and yet they did it. Mary said, do whatever he tells you. They did what Jesus said. Do we have that same kind of faith when God asks us to do something, whether it costs us time or costs us money or costs us energy or costs us, I don't know, maybe like we think our reputation might be hurt? Are we willing to do whatever it takes, no matter the cost? These guys just went out, filled the water jars. Let's see what happens. Moving on to verse 8 and the beginning of verse 9. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So in that simple act of obedience, do whatever he tells you. Fill the jars with water. Jars are filled. Okay, take some out. The water becomes something different. And they take it to the master of ceremonies, the guy in charge of putting this all together. And something had happened just in the simple act of obeying. Sometimes we think that for God to move, it's got to be something miraculous or spectacular. This was definitely miraculous, but we think there has to be some kind of spectacular thing involved. Like, for example, in this story, Jesus made a grapevine grow. The grapes ripened in 30 seconds. The grapes got smashed and turned into something else. Nope, just ordinary water, ordinary obedience, ordinary filling the jars. And this is what happened. Moving on, finishing verse 9 and going on to verse 10. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and the he is the master of the banquet, called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. So Mary said, do whatever he tells you. He tells them, fill the jars with ordinary water. Take some to the master of the banquet. And when that guy tastes it, it is no longer water. It is no longer just plain old, super watered down or tasteless or whatever the wine was like that was normally served. This was better. You have saved the best till now. Jesus moved and did the best. The best. He didn't just bring out whatever quality of wine normally came when the wine ran out or when the wine was getting low or however it worked. It was better than what was normal. Do we trust that God is going to do the best? He says that he has come so we might have life and life abundantly. The best life. A simple command from Mary, do whatever he tells you. She took an ordinary need, like don't let these people be embarrassed, Jesus, the wine's running out. She didn't try to give him any instructions on how to do it or what not to do, or you better do it before someone sees, or you got to do it in this many minutes, or she didn't give him anything. She just said, do whatever he tells you. They fill the jars with ordinary water. They take some of the ordinary water out, and Jesus had done a miracle, turning it into the best. Do we have the kind of faith that says, God, I got this problem. Just do the best. Because I think often we say, God, I got this problem, and here's what you got to do. You got to do this and this and this, and if you don't do that, then this is going to happen, or this person's going to do that. And we can only see a small piece of the picture. And what we are even envisioning in our mind as a way for God to fix it isn't even necessarily the best. God will do the best. When we take our needs to him, he doesn't just do it and fix it. He fixes it and does it the best. That's the kind of faith we need to lay our burdens at his feet. Do whatever he tells you. And watch as he takes our ordinary water, our ordinary struggles, our ordinary fear of embarrassment, or whatever it might be, and turn it into the best. Because that's the kind of God we serve, that can take ordinary water and turn it into the best. We seek after you, God. We lay our burdens before you.
Thank you, Lord.
We know that you hear. We know that you answer. We read, God, about how you turned water into wine. A simple request, God, with an extraordinary result. Something ordinary into the best. The burdens we are carrying this morning, we lay them at your feet. And we say, do whatever he says.
Thank you.
Be the mighty miracle-working God that you have always been. Give us a peace that passes all understanding while we watch you move, while we watch you do immeasurably more than all we could ever ask or think or imagine. And God, when our faith feels weak, we cry out and say, God, help our unbelief. Strengthen us to lay these burdens down, and strengthen us to leave them there, God, to not pick them up again and try to carry them and fix them all ourselves. Be the same God who has moved yesterday and today and forever. We pray these things in your name. And all of God's people said, amen. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.